Hello class, Mr. Young here with Chapter 18, Lesson 2. Today's lesson is called The Radicals Take Control. At the end of the lesson, we're going to have a writing prompt, so an assignment type submission. But let's get started on the content, shall we? The Johnson plan for admittance back in the Union for the South was not too bad. In fact, those radical Republicans thought Johnson was not being very tough at all. They thought he was going too easy, just like Lincoln. When all the delegates from the new governments of the South arrived in Washington, D.C., the radical Republicans would not seat them. They were determined to make this process as long and painful for the whites of the South as they could. So the new governments of the South were forming under the Johnson Plan, and already they were making moves to try and restore the status quo as much as possible, which infuriated the radical Republicans. Black codes were passed in the South to control the newly freed slaves. They were a lot like slave codes. They were a little different depending on where you were, but they basically tried to keep African Americans stuck in servitude. For example, in some places, they were not allowed to own or even rent land. They basically had the legal status to keep doing what they were doing before. Just maybe they get paid, at poverty. To combat these actions, like these new not even slave codes anymore, basically, like these new black codes, Congress made two new laws. In 1866, they passed policy to expand the power of the Freedmen's Bureau, we learned about in the last lesson, giving it the ability to set up special courts to try to more or less bring those to trial who were violating the new African American rights. The Congress also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which made African American citizens and overturned the Dred Scott decision. So that's in the past now. That's good. President Johnson vetoed both bills, saying that they were unconstitutional. Basically, unconstitutional overreach by the Congress, by the legislature. He said that not all states were represented with these decisions. All right. Congress had enough votes to override that veto, and they both became law anyways. So you need a certain amount to send it to the president, and the president can veto it. But if you have like a super majority in Congress, you can make it pass even if the president vetoes it, which is what happened here. So both of those policies went into effect. At this point, Congress and the radical Republicans basically said, you know what? Johnson's not going to help us do anything, so we're just going to push everything through ourselves with no support from the president whatsoever. That brings us to the 14th Amendment. The short of this is that the Republicans were worried that at some time down the line that they could lose power and the rights and citizenship that they granted to basically all the freed slaves, the freedmen, would be taken away by some new law or some new court decision. To make it really permanent, they passed and the states ratified the 14th Amendment in 1868, which says, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." So basically now they could not take away the right of freed African Americans to own land or guns or anything like that, or voting rights without due process. And they very well weren't going to send every African American to court to take away their right to vote. So it sort of put the nail in the coffin, if you would, and any ideas the South had of taking over the legislature at some point and removing those rights from African Americans. Some folks thought this amendment was a little overboard, but increased violence against African Americans in the South convinced a lot of these more moderates and a lot of moderate Republicans that African Americans needed more legal protection. The southern states initially refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, but it ended up being a requirement for southern states to get back into the Union for them to ratify it. So they ended up having to accept it to become states again. All right, radical change, or rather, radicals in charge. President Johnson waged a PR war in the congressional election of 1866 as public relations. He made a big to-do about the 14th Amendment and how bad it was. His plan backfired, and the radical Republicans won sweeping victories everywhere. They won so many seats in Congress that they could override any presidential veto basically meaning they could pass any laws they wanted without any fear of it not passing. They could do whatever they wanted. And that's why this new era after 1866 is called Radical Reconstruction, because the Radical Republicans were in charge and they could do anything they wanted. Such was their high representation in Congress. In 1867, 10 of the 11 Confederate states were still refusing to ratify the 14th Amendment. In response, the Radical Republicans passed the First and Second Reconstruction Act. The first act divided all the defiant southern states into 5 military districts with a strong Union Army presence and a general in charge of each district, basically to run those states. While the states created new state governments in which former government or Confederate leaders were not allowed to participate. So they turned them into military districts and then made them form new governments, and they couldn't have any Confederate leaders in these new governments. So they're basically dropping the hammer on these states. Their new constitutions and governments had to guarantee voting rights to African American males, and the states needed all new constitutions. Back to the drawing board. The Second Reconstruction Act allowed the Army to register voters and help organize the constitutional conventions. Why do they need the Army for this? You have to understand that to be a black man or woman, or just black in general, in the South at this time was very dangerous because there were a lot of angry, bitter Southerners still mad that they lost the Civil War, and now that the Union is giving all these rights to their former slaves. They didn't like that, so it was dangerous to be a black man in the South during Reconstruction. And so they needed protection, literally, from the Army to do basic things like vote. With the protection of the Army, many African Americans played a role in the creation of the new Southern governments. The African American vote was mostly Republican, as it was the Republicans that set them free. Between this and the fact that some white Southerners, who would have been Southern Democrats, refused to even partake in the voting process, Republicans basically took charge of these new Southern governments, which would go on to rejoin the Union. Quickly on impeachment, at this point things get dicey. Radical Republicans are doing what they want, but really they're only 1/3 of the government. You know, there's the legislative branch, there's still the executive branch, which is the president. We know Johnson's not for all this Reconstruction, and then there's the courts, which are sort of a null player at this point. But regardless, because Johnson was against this, he did what he could to hold up the Radicals' plans as much as he could. For example, he illegally fired a Secretary of War who was a supporter of the Radical Republican agenda. He was also, Johnson, was technically the commander-in-chief of the military, which is now in charge of the South. So he would appoint generals, sort of like anti-Reconstruction generals, to these districts. So the military was in charge of these districts, but the generals in charge were the appointees and the appointments of Johnson himself. Now, Johnson fought the Radicals tooth and nail, and as a result, the Radical Republicans technically impeached Johnson, which is just fancy talk for accusing him of wrongdoing. You can be impeached and not be found guilty. It's sort of people think that all presidents impeached, he's done. No, that just means you've been accused of it. It doesn't have to go through. So, in 1868, Johnson's impeachment trial started in the Senate. Removal from office would require a 2/3 majority, which was not achieved because even moderate Republicans agreed that this was just a political move by the Radicals to try to get Johnson out of office. And Johnson didn't break any laws, so no wrongdoing. His only crime was opposing Reconstruction. So even though Johnson was not technically removed from office, the whole process must have rattled him because at this point on, he doesn't try to get in the Radical Republicans' way quite as much. All right, the 15th Amendment. Where are we at on time? 9 minutes. In 1868, folks were hoping the craziness that was Reconstruction would be toning down. Republicans picked a new candidate to represent them for the presidency. They chose Ulysses S. Grant, hero of the Union, who accepted, General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. He ran against Democrat Horatio Seymour, who was the governor of New York. Grant won the election. People love war heroes, indicating that people were still ready. There's still more time for Reconstruction. It's called a mandate. Like, we elected this guy, so he ran on Reconstruction, so they take this as a sign that the majority of the population wants more Reconstruction. In 1869, the Republicans dotted the I, if you will, by passing the 15th Amendment, which says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So basically an amendment to protect the voting rights of newly free African Americans. Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The radical Republicans thought their work was done, and African American rights would be protected for all time. But as we will learn in the coming days, there will still be more work to do. That was not to be the case. Your assignment on the next page is a writing prompt. All the answers you would need for that are right here on this page or in the textbook in the lesson 18 section 2. And let me know if you need any help with that. But it's the kind of question where there are multiple interpretations, and as long as you read the lesson, you should get it right. But let me know if you need help, and you can always resubmit if you have to. All right. We'll pick up again tomorrow with lesson 3. Have a good one.